You know, it's wild to me how, even with all the technology we have now, there's still this fascination with what we don't fully understand, like what's going on inside the human mind. That's what we're diving into today. We're looking at Clairvoyance and Thought Transference, a book by L.W. DeLawrence. It was published back in the early 1900s.
It's a fascinating read because it gives us this snapshot of a time when scientists were really grappling with the idea of psychic phenomena. DeLawrence wasn't just dipping his toes in the water, he was diving headfirst into these concepts.
He really was, and he uses some interesting terms too. Before we go any further, let's make sure we're all on the same page. DeLawrence kicks things off with clairvoyance. He calls it soul sight, which I love.
Very evocative.
It is, but essentially he's talking about the ability to see things beyond what we normally perceive.
Right, and it's important to remember that back then, this idea of a sixth sense wasn't seen as out there as it might be today. Researchers were genuinely curious about the potential of the human mind.
It was like a whole unexplored world. But clairvoyance wasn't the only thing that fascinated him. He also digs into psychometry, which he calls soul measuring.
And that one always makes me think about someone trying to get a read on your energy, Like instead of measuring your shoe size, they're measuring your aura or something.
Right. But the way DeLawrence puts it, it's more about the ability to hold an object and somehow tap into its history, like the emotions connected to it, maybe even the people who owned it before.
It's as if, for DeLawrence, objects hold on to a kind of energy, a memory of sorts. And some people have the ability to pick up on those vibrations.
Okay, that's both really cool and a little creepy. But before we head too far down that path, there's one more term we need to unpack: thought transference. Most of us probably know this better as telepathy. It's that direct line of communication, mind to mind.
Exactly. And DeLawrence is careful to separate this from something he calls musculation. Basically, that's like reading someone's mind by watching their subtle muscle movements. He's more interested in genuine thought transference, where minds are connecting without any physical clues.
He even separates thought transference from thought reading, suggesting that transference is more of an unconscious link. Thought reading, on the other hand, is more deliberate, like one mind trying to access another on purpose.
That distinction is important because it gets at a question that fascinated a lot of people back then. How much control do we really have over our own thoughts? Could our thoughts be influenced, even manipulated from the outside? These were questions that people were exploring from both scientific and spiritual angles.
So we've got these big ideas, right? Clairvoyance, psychometry, thought transference. But DeLawrence doesn't just want to define them. He wants us to believe they're real. And he uses some pretty incredible stories to make his case. Honestly, some of this stuff will make you think twice about how much we really know about the world.
He definitely picked some attention-grabbing examples, like the story of Abraham James. He was this seemingly ordinary guy who said he could do something pretty extraordinary. See underground water sources.
Yeah, that one blew my mind. It's the 1860s, Chicago desperately needs clean water, and here comes James claiming he can find them in artesian well, using what? Intuition.
What's crazy is the level of detail he gives. It's not just, oh, there's water over there somewhere. He's describing the layers of rock and soil, how deep they need to dig, even the quality of the water itself.
It's like he had some kind of underground map in his head. And the best part, they drilled exactly where he said, and it was exactly as he described. They hit this huge source of water that totally transformed Chicago's water supply.
It's easy to get caught up in the wow factor and see that as proof, right? But we also have to at least consider other possibilities. Maybe James had some inside geological knowledge, or maybe he was just incredibly lucky. Who knows? But the story, regardless, really highlights how much we crave those unconventional solutions, that knowledge that seems to come from beyond the ordinary.
It's that desire for answers, for explanations that defy logic that pops up again and again in these stories. Like, what about the case of Captain Morton and the missing cotton?
Ah, yes. The disappearing cotton bales. DeLawrence talks about this seasoned sea captain, Captain Morton, who realizes he's short 30 bales of cotton after a long journey. He searched everywhere, but the cotton had basically vanished.
Talk about a logistical nightmare and a huge loss.
Yeah.
That's where the clairvoyant comes in, right?
Exactly. Captain Morton is desperate, so he goes to see this young woman who is rumored to have the gift of far vision.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting.
Hold on to your hats. This clairvoyant takes Captain Morton's hand, supposedly goes into a trance, and then she mentally retraces his entire voyage. She's describing the ports he stopped at, other ships he encountered, even the weather they faced.
Wait, she could see all of that just by holding his hand?
That's what DeLawrence claims, and it gets even wilder. She then pinpoints the exact spot where the cotton vanished and even mentions a big black ship with a red mark that was docked nearby.
No way. Did they ever find the cotton?
You bet they did.
Mm-hmm.
Turns out they were able to track down this black ship. It was an American vessel called the Brunswick. And guess what? The missing cotton had been loaded onto the wrong ship by mistake.
It's like something straight out of a movie. Only instead of clues and detectives, it's psychic visions and long-distance mind reading.
DeLawrence definitely knew how to tell a good story. And while it's healthy to be a little skeptical, we have to remember he was writing during a time when people were really captivated by this idea of psychic phenomena.
It's like those stories, even if they're embellished, tapped into something deeper. Like this feeling that maybe, just maybe, there's more to the world than we realize. And DeLawrence doesn't limit himself to lost objects and seafaring tales. He also explores how clairvoyance could be used in medicine.
Oh, absolutely. He talks about cases where clairvoyance supposedly diagnosed illnesses that had doctors totally stumped. One that comes to mind is the story of Mrs. D.
What was her story? What made her ability so special?
Well, according to DeLawrence, Mrs. D had this uncanny ability to see inside the human body, as if it were transparent. She claimed she could see organs, tissues, even blood flow, all through clairvoyant vision.
Hold on. So she was like a psychic x-ray machine.
That's one way to put it.
Mm.
He tells a story about a friend of his who'd been dealing with awful chest pains for years. Doctors were baffled, couldn't figure out the cause. Some thought it was his heart. Others thought maybe a neurological thing. Nobody could agree.
So what happened? Did Mrs. D swoop in and save the day?
That's where DeLawrence says she came in. He brought his friend to see her, and without knowing anything about his medical history, Mrs. D supposedly described seeing a tumor pressing against his aorta. She even described its size, color, the way it pulsed.
Okay, that's a very specific and kind of terrifying diagnosis.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The crazy part is that when DeLawrence's friend finally saw a specialist, her diagnosis was right. He had an aneurysm, which is life-threatening if left untreated.
Wow. So if it weren't for Mrs. D, who knows what might have happened?
Right. Now, again, it's important to remember there could be other explanations. Maybe she was incredibly intuitive, picking up on cues that others missed. Or maybe it was a bit of everything. Observation, deduction, and maybe, just maybe, a touch of something we don't fully understand.
It really makes you think, right? Whether we believe these stories or not, they make us reconsider the limits of what we think we know about human perception. And they bring up that big question. If these abilities are real, can we learn them? Can we develop them ourselves?
That's a question DeLawrence wrestles with, too. He seemed to believe that we all have some hidden psychic potential, like some untapped wellspring of extraordinary abilities just waiting to be unlocked. He even suggests exercises and techniques for cultivating these powers, which we'll get into later. Hold on. Are we going to talk about psychic training? I am so in. But before we go full-on Jedi Master, I'm really curious to hear more about what DeLawrence says about psychometry. He seems to believe it's more than just a party trick, that it might have real-world applications.
Absolutely. And he backs it up with some intriguing examples. These are stories that, even if we approach them with a healthy dose of skepticism, force us to at least consider the possibility that objects hold on to some kind of energetic memory, a trace of the people and events they've encountered. So we're really digging into this idea of psychometry. And I gotta say, the thought that everyday objects could be holding on to pieces of the past, like little energy signatures, is kind of blowing my mind a little.
It definitely challenges what we think of as normal, right?
Sure.
DeLawrence talks about these two guys, Dr. Buchanan and Professor Denton, who were really into psychometry. They didn't see it as some parlor trick. They thought it was a legitimate area of study.
That's a pretty bold statement. What kind of research were they doing?
Well, Dr. Buchanan started with these really basic experiments, focusing on the senses. He'd have people hold different metals and tell them what they experienced.
Okay, so like they'd hold a piece of metal and suddenly be able to tell what it was just by touch.
Not quite. He wasn't focusing on touch so much as their other senses. Like people would report tasting things, feeling physical sensations, even having emotional responses, all just from holding a piece of metal.
Wait, seriously, so they'd hold like a copper pipe and say they could taste copper.
That's what Buchanan claimed. He even experimented with running electric currents through different substances, like medicines, and having people hold the wires. People described experiencing the effects of the drugs without actually swallowing anything.
Whoa, that's both Fascinating and a little freaky.
Right. He really thought these objects could transfer something of their essence, their energy, directly to the nervous system.
Okay, wild. What about Professor Denton? How did he approach psychometry?
Denon was more into the stories objects held, the historical and personal stuff. He claimed his family, especially his wife and kids, were naturally gifted psychometers. Give them an object, and they could give you a crazy amount of detail about its past.
So, like, they could hold something, an old pocket watch, let's say, and know who made it, who owned it, even what kind of person that owner was.
That's exactly what Denton believed. He traveled all over, collecting all kinds of things, ancient artifacts, rocks, everyday objects. He wanted to see just how far psychometry could go. He thought it could change how we understand history, even unlock the secrets of the human mind.
That's a lot of faith to put in a bunch of old things. How did DeLawrence and the people back then know if someone was actually psychometric or just really good at guessing?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It's important to remember that the scientific world was pretty different back then. The lines between intuition, subjective experience, and what we consider hard evidence today, well, those lines were a lot blurrier.
So are you saying we should take all these stories about psychometry with a grain of salt?
It's always a good idea to be a little skeptical, but that doesn't mean we should just dismiss these stories outright. DeLawrence and his contemporaries were asking real questions about perception, about what the human mind is capable of. They just didn't have the same tools and methods we have now to explore them with the same level of scientific rigor.
That makes sense. It's like they were explorers in a new land, but without a good map or the right equipment. Still, they were asking the important questions. And DeLawrence does tell some pretty compelling stories, like that one about the journalist, Mr. Stead, and the shilling.
Oh yeah, the tale of the shilling. It's a classic example of how emotions and energy might be transferred to an object. Stead had this shilling given to him by a woman who was dying. He decided to see if it had any, shall we say, psychometric juice.
Okay, I'm hooked. What did he do?
He gave it to two different psychometers, both women,
Ah.
without telling them anything about it or where it came from.
Didn't they pick up on anything?
Get this. Both women, totally independently, described a woman in distress, a woman who gave away her last shilling as an act of generosity. They even described how she looked, her emotional state, and it all lined up with what Stead knew about the woman.
That's kind of spooky, actually. It's like by holding that shilling, they were transported back to this woman's final moments.
That's exactly the kind of story that got people fired up about psychometry. DeLawrence tells another one about a reverend, Minot J. Savage, who gave a psychometrist a sealed letter.
Wait, so she couldn't actually read what was in the letter?
Nope, totally sealed. But she was able to describe the guy who wrote it, his job, his personality, even that he wasn't feeling well at the time, and she was right.
Wow. It's like these objects act as a link between people across time and space. That's incredible and honestly a little unnerving.
Lawrence definitely thought it was incredible. He even suggests that this soul measuring, this ability to connect with the history inside objects, is something we can all learn to do. He has all these exercises in his book, Ways to Focus Your Attention, to tune into the subtle energies he believed objects have.
So you're saying we could all be like psychometric detectives. Maybe I should put down the mystery novels and start practicing with my grandma's old locket. Who knows what I might find?
Well, while I wouldn't quit your day job just yet, I do think there's something to be said for being more curious, for paying attention to those moments of intuition, those weird little connections we often brush off as coincidences.
Yeah, I get that. Maybe the big takeaway here isn't so much about developing superpowers, but about realizing how connected we are to each other, to the things around us, even to the past in ways we don't always understand.
I think DeLawrence would have liked that idea. At heart, he was captivated by the mysteries of the mind, by the potential that exists beyond our five senses. Whether we agree with all his conclusions or not, his work forces us to think outside the box, to be open to the unknown, and to admit that maybe, just maybe, there's more to this world than meets the eye.
I like that. And on that note, to everyone listening, keep exploring, keep asking those questions because you never know what you might discover. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into clairvoyance and psychometry. Until next time, stay curious.